Now, South Africa, like the rest of the world, is experiencing increasing urbanization, with more than two-thirds, that's 67% of its population living in cities by 2020. However, the country's metropoles have made little progress in achieving important development targets, and cities are facing infrastructure issues, while at the same time cutting spending on operational maintenance. To unpack this further, I am joined by a research fellow at the Department of Public Administration and Management at the University of the Free State, Dr. Harlan Cloete. Doc, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. This, of course, being a very important, still developing story with regards to what happened last week. Hearing all these politicians from different political parties blaming an act and everything else. But let's tell the truth. How much of this has to do with public administration and mismanagement of public funds?
Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon also to your viewers. I think you are quite right. You know, the problem of local government is complex, but it is never one thing. You know, it's a combination of so many factors that impede on the ability of local government to deliver the services to the community. The number one issue, of course, is the issue of leadership. I think report after report, and if you just take the report of the Auditor General as a yardstick, it talks about accountable and ethical leadership is the problem in our country.
And now let's talk about, some of the budgets that have been, passed in the city of Johannesburg through the years. A lot of it is also about how much they plan to change the city, how much they plan to bring it back to that world-class African city that they always describe. But we never really see that come into fruition, right? Instead, they are just stuck in council for weeks on end, cancelling debates that they're supposed to have because they're so focused, especially lately, on motions of no confidence and caucus.
You know, the late, not the late, British politician Margaret Thatcher said, that don't tell me what to do, I know what to do, show me how. I think we've got a problem in many of our municipalities on the issue of how. We have good intentions. Sometimes we do not have the political will. Sometimes the political will is lacking. And so we've got two problems in municipalities. It's sometimes the lack of capacity. In other words, the individual competence set is not there. And then secondly, the issue of capability. And capability has got to do with the processes, the infrastructure, the processes, the ability to get the work done, And so there's a lot of intent. There's a lot of intent and goodwill and grand policy documents, but often they're at the behest of an administration either who do not necessarily have the capacity and the capability to be able to deliver, or you may have a lack of political oversight where politicians, instead of focusing on making sure that plans are implemented, instead are fighting one another. And so it is the cesspool of issues that face local government. So we've got a capacity problem in local government, and yet we also have a capability problem in local government where the institution seem to not be able to deliver on the mandate.
Now, let's look at the budget that was actually the budget speech by the MMC of Finance here in Johannesburg, Dada Morero. It's an 80 billion rand budget, 73 billion rand of it being for operational expenditure. At some point, there was a protest in Diepkloof by residents of a hostel about how poorly they live, the poor living conditions that they are in. Kabelo Kwamanda, as mayor, went there and announced this grand plan of 120 million rand that is going to be used for that particular housing project. But, when you look at all of this and you hear them talk about all the money that is going to come in and then come back and blame an act of 1998 about illegal evictions, etc., this is about housing. It's about the crisis of housing in the city of Johannesburg. It's not about an individual or a said building, which, by the way, with this one, was actually a building that was abandoned by the city itself.
Yeah, I think we have a crisis of confidence in leadership. Communities have reached a point where they no longer trust politicians. I think politicians will find it very difficult to sell the message to the electorate. After 30 years, we have a pretty good idea about what leadership looks like in our cities. And so communities have almost lost confidence. Not almost, I think they have lost confidence. there's a crisis of confidence in local elected leadership and in our political system as a whole. That's why we would see, if you look at the 2021 elections, so many of the young people just simply stayed away because they say all of you are the same. There's a feeling amongst the electorate that politicians don't care. They're only interested in their own self-glorification. They're interested in the merc and the perk, but they're not necessarily interested to work with citizens to better their lives. They're the first to arrive at the scene, and then they start with the blame game. And so we've got a fantastic plan in this country called the National Development Plan that sets out the framework about where it is that we should go. However, if you look at our public discourse, if you look at local government, there's hardly ever even mentioned of the National Development Plan. And so our politicians, our administrations, I don't think that there's a lack of seriousness. There's a lack of political will. And sometimes you can have all the will in the world, but if you do not have the people or the capacity in the people to be able to turn your dreams into reality, that is also then useless. And so good strategy. You can have the best strategies, but if our strategies cannot be transformed into improved life, for millions of South Africans, the dream of 1994 of a better life for all very soon turned out to be a better life for some and not for all. And I think that is the general feeling of the public, that they are losing faith and confidence. That's why we see so many service delivery protests. They are losing confidence in the ability of the politicians and of local government in particular to make their dreams come true.
You mentioned the National Development Plan. This was the grand plan of the governing party, at least on a national level, back in 2012. We're now in 2023, going on to 2024. We've got about 7 years to achieve the goals that they set for themselves in 2012. Yeah. We're very far from achieving a lot of those goals.
Very, very far. You remember in 2014 we were supposed to halve unemployment, and that pipe dream is gone. And so there's a lack of political will. The National Development Plan clearly sets out what are the challenges, and then it talks two things in that National Development Plan: active citizenry, and I don't think we've got a lack of active citizenry. And then it talks about leadership. It talks about leadership at all levels of society. And what we've seen in the last decade in this country is a lack of leadership, be it in the private sector and also in government, but particular government who's at the coalface. We've seen a lack of leadership. We've seen a lack of decisiveness. We know what is the problem, but we seem to be caught up in this paralysis analysis. We talk about the problem all the time. When do we start talking about practical solutions, and how do we co-govern? How does government then open up, to say, many of these answers lies within society, but we've got a complete lack of leadership on all levels of our society.
Yeah, and it's not even a lack of leadership, it's also a lack of accountability that we're seeing here in South Africa. Nobody is taken to task among them as different political parties, except the squabbles that they have in the National Assembly or different legislatures. Now, the Premier of Gauteng, I'm interested to know what you think there, Doc. With the Premier of Gauteng's announcement yesterday, Panyaza Lusufi announcing a commission of inquiry that would be led, I think, by Justice Khampempe in terms of investigating what happened at that particular Joburg building. But of course, this has been a problem for decades. And what's worse, like I said earlier, this is a building that was abandoned by government itself. Is it going to help us at all? South Africa is a country riddled with commissions of inquiry. There's recommendations, and it's hardly ever implemented.
I think you are quite right. Another commission of inquiry, people ask, we must go look at the root causes. This would have never have happened. It would never have happened if government did not abandon its building. So in other words, it's a government building. It is even worse. In other words, we can't even police our own. And so the broken window theory says once a window is broken, comes from New York, you need to fix it before it becomes culture. When that building, those buildings were never meant for people to live in. And so government has failed miserably, the city of Johannesburg, to even police its own policies. So we've got bylaws that we are not policing, that we are not checking whether we are sticking to that. And so there's, like you rightly said earlier, there's very little consequence. And so once a society sees that I can get away with this, then a second person does it and there's no consequence. And in many cases, the police that we've seen, in many places, the police are sometimes too scared. And so there's a criminal element as well behind a lot of these hijacked buildings. And so lack of will to act because of the consequences for my pocket. And so it's a lack. Another commission of inquiry, I would think, in my view, is just a waste of time.
And probably a waste of money that was supposed to be used to actually fix the problem. Now we're using that money to try and catch up with the problem that has already happened. Just lastly, Doc, from you, with this Illegal Evictions Act of 1998 and some government officials coming out to blame that particular act, but they are the lawmakers. They go and sit in Parliament in different settings to, change a bill and give it to the President to actually sign into law. It was signed into law by them in 1998. So to blame that now, even though you're a government of the country, you still have to follow what is stipulated in the law that you created.
No, exactly. We've developed a framework. It's a very simple framework based on Michael Barber's, who was the delivery champion for Tony Blair, called Governance 5 IQ. And it says, in any government department, if anybody listening, you can apply this. Firstly, we need to find out why we do what we do. And then secondly, we need to know we're not there to steal or to loot. We're there to make sure that we deliver service to the people. Secondly, how do we do what we do? And in other words, there need to be the daily disciplines in government departments to be able to do the work. You are there to work, not to sell Tupperware, for example. The third thing, what happens if we are not on track? We need a system to check. We need a system to check what happens if we're not on track. And then fourthly, if we're not on track, what then happens? If we know, how do we take corrective action, what you talked about, consequence management? And then finally, how do we lead and learn? If we apply these 5 governance principles, I promise you, called Governance 5 IQ, departments have a bigger chance of succeeding, because a lot of people are at work today, but they are absent, the person is there, but he's not there. And so the productivity is so very low. And so the first question that we ask ourselves is, why do we do what we do? If I'm a public servant, that means I serve the greater good of the public, and I must make sure that I give the public service my very best. If I lead, I should lead. I'm not there to loot. Government is not a spaza shop where I can use the infrastructure or resources to make sure that I advance my own interests and that of my family. And so we have developed through research a simple 5-question system called Governance 5 IQ that can get a conversation going amongst colleagues at work so that we can stay on track and do the work that we must do. For many South Africans, the pre-94 nightmare has not yet ended. South Africa continues to be the most unequal country in the world, according to the World Bank. So it's a failure of our economic policies, but it's also a failure of the political will to make sure that everybody gets their place in the sun.
Doc, thank you so much for having a conversation with me about this important topic. Research Fellow in the Department of Public Administration and Management at the University of the Free State, Dr. Harlan Cloete.